Welcome, everyone. I'm Dr. Donald Wallenfang. What a pleasure to join you in this live stream entitled The Metaphysics of Spirit, Human, Angelic, and Divine. Thinking about spiritual being, taking commentary from my 2017 book, Human and Divine Being, a study on the theological anthropology of Edith Stein. I just love to think along with Edith Stein and her thinking human being as body soul in relation to divine being, in relation to angelic being, in relation to being in general, all the various diverse kinds of being that fill the universe, fill earth. And I never tire of thinking along with her, especially about spiritual being. What is spirit? So I want to continue where I left off in a previous live stream with one of the most concentrated definitions Edith Stein gives us, thinking spiritual being, when she writes that this personal, subjective spiritual being remains within itself while going out of itself. This going out of itself pertains to the spiritual essentially. It is indicative of its being completely selfless, not indeed in the sense of having no self, but rather in the sense of a total self-surrender without any loss of self, a self-giving in which the spiritual reveals itself completely. So if we think along with Stein on the unique characteristics of personal spiritual being, we think of the person, the human being, first of all, that we are human beings in relation to other human beings. First of all, these relationships. And what Stein is saying again, what is this personal spiritual being? It remains within itself, all the while going out of itself. And phenomenologically, the self is pushed out of itself because of the proximity of the other person who faces me. And so I'm attentive to this other one here. And the personality comes alive, is manifested and proclaimed through the interpersonal interaction. This movement where the self takes leave of itself toward the other, all the while remaining within itself. So we have this interiority that especially characterizes what we mean by spiritual being. But it's an interiority that is revealed through the ethical proximity of persons. So the interiority expresses itself through exteriority as an ethical response to the other person who is near me, who I am aware of. And it's this relationship between interiority and this movement of exteriority that spirit reveals itself, that the person is revealed. That we talk about intersubjective experience, interpersonal knowledge, and something like the experience of empathy, which is very central to Edith Stein's work. And a later chapter in this book, chapter 7, will talk about empathy. But for now, we want to think again, what is spirit? Again, Stein says, spirit, in terms of personal spiritual being, as a personal subject, remains within itself while going out of itself. And this going out of itself pertains to the spiritual essentially. This going out of itself, not just in terms of the senses attuned to the world, of receiving all this sense data, but with this interiority is an intentionality, a very central concept in phenomenology. So what we're after here is the metaphysical substance of spirit, which has to do with form rather than matter, which has to do more so with act rather than potency. And the evidence of personal spiritual being is in the ethical dramatics of interpersonal relationship, the ethical dramatics of interpersonal relationship. The self has an intentionality facing the other, in response to the other, in response to the call of the other. And this movement from interiority to exteriority is this, we could say, a very, I want to say, yes, empirical point of recognizing the activity of spiritual being. The hidden activity of spiritual being is revealed in and through what the body is doing. What the body is doing through language, through the body language in relation to the other. This relationship is the self-revelation of spirit. So we have this intentionality of the interiority going out of itself that we're calling personal exteriority. This pertains to spiritual being, personal spiritual being, essentially. And what else she says, it's indicative of being completely selfless. So the paradox of being a self, to become a self through this selfless solicitude for the other person who faces me. So the self has itself, but through this total self-surrender to the other, what we call not only empathy, but moreover love, this intentionality of love, and these real acts of love are evidence of personal spiritual being. They are its culture. Self-surrender without any loss of self, a self-giving in which the spiritual reveals itself completely. So we have this language, love as self-giving. This being for the other, being toward the other, being concerned with the other. Love, self-giving, is the activity of spiritual being. Atoms don't love. Elements on the periodic table don't love. There's no evidence in themselves that they love. And it's not just some certain configuration we call the human body that loves. It is the soul that loves. It is the spiritual core of the person that loves. It is the form of the person, spirit. Metaphysics calls the soul anima forma corporis. The soul is the form of the material body. This is what loves, and the acts of love are evident. And at the highest degree, the acts of love involve a sacrifice, an intentional giving of the body. This is why I think maternity is one of our best in the flesh depictions of spirit, maternity. How the other, the little other, feeds on the flesh of his or her mother in breastfeeding, and first of all, before being born, through the umbilical cord, the symbiotic relationship between mother and child is evidence of spirit. The mother's love of the child being nourished by her, from her, and not just physically, but nourished above all by her love. This is the stuff of spiritual being. The body is the medium, mediates the act, the intentionality of spirit. But this interiority, this intentionality, this phenomenality of empathy, this ecstatic movement of the self outside of itself through this exteriorizing of the intentionality of love through the flesh, which we can call altogether self-giving, is the activity of spirit. It has its potencies, but it is a constant fire burning in a living person that wants to share its light, share its warmth, and come to know this other person, not as some biological fact, that can be dissected and divided up into different smaller parts. But in the totality of his or her personhood, this concern for the saturating totality of the mystery of the person is the stuff of spirit, of the human soul, of an angel, and by way of analogy, of divinity. So, the metaphysics of spirit, we're getting at it with Edith Stein. She writes in her book, Finite and Eternal Being, on this edition, page 360, that quote I just read, one of the most precise, helpful definitions of what is spiritual being. And to take time to unpack it. This is why I've dedicated so many live streams to the question, what is spirit? What is spiritual being? Because it's not something we can just talk about in an hour and move on. Even after I do several live streams talking about spirit, it still will be inadequate, will still only be beginning. But I have to dedicate several live streams to this question. In a letter that Edith Stein writes in the year 1940 to her friend, Sister Agnella Stadtmüller, Stein says this, quote, "Should we strive for perfect love, you ask? Absolutely. For this we were created. Perfect love will be our eternal life. And here we have to seek to come as close to it as possible here in this life. Jesus became incarnate in order to be our way. What can we do?" And she says this, "Try with all our might to be empty. The senses mortified, the memory as free as possible from all images of this world, and through hope directed toward heaven, the understanding stripped of natural seeking and ruminating, directed to God in the straightforward gaze of faith. The will surrendered to God in love." So if we think about what Stein is saying here in this letter, she's getting it especially from St. John of the Cross in his work, The Ascent of Mount Carmel, The Dark Night. This gradual emptying of the higher faculties of the soul, the spiritual core of the person, the intellect, the memory, and the will. The intellect emptied by faith, the theological virtue of faith, the memory emptied by the theological virtue of hope, and the will emptied by the theological virtue of love. So this intentional kenosis of the person that happens not just by willpower, but precisely through surrender of the higher faculties of the soul of a person, the intellect, the memory, and the will, to God, to divinity, to what God would make of them, to the metamorphosis of the soul that is brought about by divine act, divine power, divine love, faith, hope, and love. Allow the intellect, the memory, and the will to reach their highest potential by allowing the pure actuality of divinity to actualize the act potency of the creature. And I say act potency because the creature is not in pure act like God. And so the creature is radically in potency. And for these potencies to be actualized, above all, it's a question of divine operation on the person. This is what Edith Stein is getting at here in this letter, and how she's understanding spiritual being and what does it mean to love, and why is surrender and intentional self-emptying required for love. This is the evidence of love. This is the proof of love, that there was a human act that was sincere, that was genuine, that was responsible, and the act happened at a cost to the self. There was sacrifice, and it can't be explained in terms of animal instinct, fight or flight response, even the conatus ascendi. It can't be explained in these terms. It's something else is coming on the scene of human activity, and it's properly called supernatural. It's beyond the capacities of nature as nature. There's something going on here of this agape love, we say in the Greek, that is not self-interested. It's not exclusively self-interested, but it operates according to this disinterested solicitude for the other, where there's an authenticity about the intentionality of a self that gives itself up for the sake of the other, for the good of the other, with joy, with the unity of all these different kinds of virtues. It's an intentional giving oneself up for the sake of the other, even to the point of abandonment, which is actually, we would reason, impossible for a human being to do. This is why it's the act of God, ultimately. How could somebody be a martyr and not a destructive act of terrorism type of thing, but a martyr that is someone is being innocent, they're harming no one, and yet they're being put to death because of what he or she believes. It's beyond nature what's going on in the witness of the martyr, the testimony of the martyr. Nature can't explain what's happening here because they know full well they're going to die and they will refuse to renounce their faith. There's something happening in them that exceeds the exigencies of nature. And we said what's happening in the martyr is something supernatural. It's not of his or her own power. If it were just up to him or her, they would renounce whatever semantics are going on and just keep living and bow down once again to the conatus ascendi, the struggle of being, of self-preservation, one's own being, and going on to consume things in order to persevere in one's being. But instead, the martyr, there's something happening in the martyr that can't be explained in terms of natural causes. It's a supernatural occurrence, a supernatural event. It is, above all, an act of spirit that is transcending the constrictions of nature, of the body. It is an overcoming of bios by Zoe, this life in the spirit. So to recall, this complete self-revelation of spirit constitutes its transparency and luminosity. The self-revelation of the person, at its best, there's a transparency, there's a luminosity, a radiation of goodness, of mystery, a glory that is at once revealed and concealed in the mystery of the person. Instead of a hard, opaque, and dense material body that protrudes in space and time, spiritual being, by its very nature, which always involves something of supernature, is translucent and imperceptible in its essence by materially constructed senses, namely sight, hearing, smelling, taste, touch. We say the five senses. It is not immediately perceptible by as a sense datum. Spirit in itself, in its essence, is not an object, not a material object, not made of atoms, not something that's going to come across the material senses of the body and say, there I see spirit, I hear spirit. Spirit itself is revealed through the unity of the senses. In child psychology with Maurice Merleau-Ponty, we understand this. The perception of the child, there's a unity of the senses in such a way that there's not a distinction of this is a sense datum of sight, and this is a sense datum of hearing, and this is a sense datum of taste. But instead, it's this immediate coordination of perception and its unity. That is the five senses and beyond. It is the perception of meaning, and it is a hermeneutics of wonder. It is a contemplative hermeneutics in which we don't even have so much concern about making distinctions between matter and spirit, body and soul. We're talking about the phenomenality of life, which proceeds with a transcendent, ecstatic being toward the other, and the possibility of being for the other, this intentionality of love and responsibility that exceeds all empirical reductionisms. Empirical investigation is always in the wake of the activity of spirit. It gathers up its various material data that in themselves are very interesting, but it implies that the event of being has long since taken place, and we're gathering up the fragments of a certain kind of residue of meaningful acts as spiritual beings. Therefore, the nature of spirit can be said to be unnaturally natural, that is, supernatural, and thereby immaterial, and as such, the necessary inversion of materiality and that conatus ascendi as autonomous self-preservation. So even though Edith Stein herself does not use this language of the inversion of material being is what we mean by spiritual being, I'm suggesting that this is a way to understand it, in a sense, the photographic negative of material being. What do we have with matter inverted metaphysically? When we have matter as potency, and what is the necessary opposite act? What is the necessary opposite form? Matter as an effect of a prior cause that instantiates this form and that form with the matter, with the hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, sulfur, carbon. There's some formal causality that is acting before and behind the material and efficient causality that makes a thing what it is through the course of time, in between the bookends of no longer and not yet, hovering just barely above non-being and actually being a being for a time in this universe. So in future live streams, I'll do more with the four causes of Aristotle, formal, material, efficient, and final causes. But for now, I just want to hint at these. Spiritual being, personal spiritual being, revealing itself completely to the point of abandonment. Spiritual reality is the absolute kenotic inversion of material reality. Therein disclosing the intuition of the life-giving principle and substructure of the entire cosmic order. We might ask, why does an angel not have a body, not have a material body? And we could say, because if the angel had a material body, he would have given it away long ago. And this is what the hero does in every epic and every drama and every literary masterpiece worthy of the name. The hero gives himself up to the point of abandonment. She gives herself up without remainder. The body becomes a medium of this intentionality of love, this intentionality of responsibility. The body itself is not an absolute when it comes to the hero paradigm, the hero motif, the hero mythos, the hero narrative. The narrative of Jesus, of God become flesh, is one in which the destiny is already revealed in the beginning. As British mystic of the 20th century Carol Houselander puts it, At Bethlehem, we have the inscape of Golgotha. And his destiny is sure. The wood of the cradle is the wood of the cross. The bookends of the hero are exposure and sacrifice to the point of abandonment without remainder. This absolute kenotic inversion of material reality as a testimony that there is something much more essential to being than matter. It is spirit. And spirit will testify to itself through the sacrifice of the body. Spirit is known among the heroes of our ancestors, among those heroes of the present who are in the process of giving themselves up to the point of abandonment out of love for the other. They've recognized this inbuilt vocation of being human, and that the body itself is a wonderful template to express the prerogatives of spirit. Spirit loves matter because matter is its best art form. Matter, the human body, is very vulnerable, it's very susceptible, it's very feeble and frail. Even the strongest ones, the fittest ones. The human body, by some small particles, can die. By some small bacteria, some small virus, some small contaminant can die in an instant. And we tend to gloss over this fact about our existence, but it's true. And we only have to think about the most recent loved ones who have died and how they died and what happened there. But the beauty of the body is that precisely in and through its vulnerability, does spirit make its greatest expression? Does spirit risk its greatest exposure? And this we have again writ large in God become human, Jesus of Nazareth. And this is what he wanted to say to the whole of creation. I love you. And this is how he said it. He was crucified. He was crucified by his beloved. He was mocked and beaten and scourged and abused and imprisoned and nailed to this wood, fastened to this wood, a crown of thorns placed on his head. And this is the King of the universe. This is God in the flesh. But what expression do we find on the face of the earth or throughout human history that says, I love you as much as this? Nothing compares. The crucifixion of the God-man, and in turn his resurrection from the dead, reveal the meaning of spirit like nothing else could. So all this philosophizing about spirit is very much subsidiary to the main event we call the Paschal mystery of Jesus, the suffering, death, and resurrection, ascension into heaven of Jesus. If we want to know what is spirit, we have to look no farther than this testimony at the center of the cosmos, as John Paul II says in his encyclical Redemptor Hominis. Jesus Christ is the center of the universe and the center of history. So this philosophy, the best it can do, what I hope it does, is point to him, and that's why I don't hesitate to make explicit this divine revelation in Jesus, and where the paradigmatic is the real, where gift is expressed to the highest degree, what we have in the church, in the sacraments, in the Eucharist, the Eucharistia, this blessed gift, this blessed giving. We're at the center of this drama of salvation is the gift, and we call it grace, and it comes very close in Emmanuel, God with us, giving us his flesh to eat, his blood to drink, through the transubstantiation of the bread and wine, become the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Jesus. This is the Catholic faith. And we have the most perfect rendezvous of desire here. All the desire that we have finds its home in the God-man, come as word and sacrament. So if we want to know what is spiritual being, why would I talk about everything on the periphery and not go to the heart of the matter? I'll go to the heart of the matter. In her book, Finite and Eternal Being, again, Edith Stein talks about the logic that is required to think towards spiritual being, or better put, according to this logic of the double negative, to let spirit be thought in me, to let truth be thought in me, to let spirit be thought in me, to let being be thought in me. Stein writes, quote, "And if the intellectual attitude to absolute being, that is divine being, being itself, is not impeded in its effect, from it will spring the effective affirmation of absolute being, as well as the practical behavior that it demands. And just as on the part of absolute being, annihilating may respond to the negation or turning away, so a heightening in being, a raising to a higher mode of being that we call grace, may respond to the turning toward. The negation of the negation and freely turning toward and the heightening in being together yield justification." End quote, Edith Stein. Whereas the material reality is concerned solely with its self-preservation and maintenance, and promotes its self-preservation and maintenance of its own being through consumption and use, spiritual being is intent on inverting intentionally the brute impulsive behavior of the creature by the power of intentional self-donating love for the other. In the latter, in this intentional self-donating love for the other, self-preservation is transfigured into other preservation, the preservation of the other person facing me, the promotion of his well-being, of his life, and that his plight becomes my own. And self-maintenance is transformed into a self-divestment, the great paradox of the self. Unless the self divests itself of itself, it does not become a self. This is the logic of the cross, the logic of the double negative. The logic of spiritual being coincides with this. According to the logic inscribed within the cosmic order, life begets life as death succumbs to death. When death dies, life is alive. Life is perpetuated. Life begets life as death succumbs to death. A recapitulation of transformed material reality transpires through its death and ensuing transfiguration of being. So, if the natural sciences give us this meta-narrative called entropy, according to especially the second law of thermodynamics, and all matter is on its way to cosmic disintegration toward a state of thermal equilibrium, 0 Kelvin, absolute zero, something like negative 263.15, something like that, negative 263.15 degrees Celsius. If this is the meta-narrative of natural science, why is there life? And why is it on the decline? Why is the whole material cosmos, this matrix of mass energy, moving gradually to the state of thermal equilibrium, absolute 0 Kelvin? As one author put it, absolute entropy implies its absolute opposite, that we call absolute being itself. So what we experience as life comes as a gift, and our being is upheld by absolute being. If we think about it, it resonates as very true. It's undeniable. There's nothing more rational to say. And so absolute entropy implies its absolute opposite. And this absolute opposite of entropy is revealed in the resurrection of Jesus from the dead. This resurrected life is the teleology of spirit, an existence that began as active spiritual being, then in turn gave itself over in the extension of a created material, though inspired universe in potentia, and finally consummates the movement of self-emptying through a return of fully actualized being in the framework of spiritual and redeemed incarnated existence, the redemption of creatures. So this is the economy of salvation revealed in Jesus and the Judeo-Christian tradition. Resurrected life is the victory of absolute being over death, as if death could ruin the project of divinity. And it cannot. God expresses the love that God is precisely in and through the eclipse of life we call death, to show that death too has no power over divine life, divine being. And as creatures, we live in the suspense of the metaxis, the in-between. The in-between, the beginning and the end. In between creatio ex nihilo and parousia. And yet, today, in the era in which we live, we're met by this kerygma, this message of redemption in Jesus. And it's already begun. The cosmic inversion of entropy has already begun. And the resurrection of Jesus from the dead. And the Blessed Mother, his mother, the first one to rise body and soul after him. We have the doctrine of the Assumption of the Blessed Virgin Mary. And this makes perfect sense why this would be the case. And we have to go into a whole theological exposition about that. But then we have the saints who don't yet enjoy the fullness of the resurrection, body and soul, but the souls are participating already in this church, triumphant, and waiting that parousia, the consummation of all things, when God will be all in all, and the bodies of the dead will be reunited to the souls. And that there would be into eternity a unity between spirit and matter, and no longer in opposition. No longer this tug-of-war between the maximum entropy and its maximum opposite we call absolute being or divinity. As if there could be any tug-of-war with divinity in any case. And this is where we live the in-between. And so through faith in Christ and his resurrection, we have hope. A hope even against hope. A hope even against the hope of a prosperous life on earth, but a hope that's greater than health, wealth, honor, pleasure, power, a hope to live into by way of participation this resurrected life of Christ. We read about this throughout Scripture, and I'll just give a couple texts. St. Paul's letter to the Romans, chapter 8, what a fantastic chapter this is in his letter to the Romans, where Paul writes, "We know that the whole creation has been groaning with labor pains together until now. And not only the creation, but we ourselves who have the first fruits of the Spirit of God, pneuma hagios, groan inwardly as we await for adoption as sons, the redemption of our bodies." In 1 Corinthians 15, St. Paul writes, "So it is with the resurrection of the dead. What is sown, like a seed in the ground, is perishable. What is raised is imperishable. It is sown in dishonor, it is raised in glory. It is sown in weakness, it is raised in power. It is sown a physical body, it is raised a spiritual body, a spiritualized physical body. If there is a physical body, there is also a spiritual body. Thus it is written, the first man, Adam, became a living soul, in Hebrew, nephesh. The last Adam became a life-giving spirit, pneuma, in Greek. But it is not the spiritual which is first, but the physical, and then the spiritual. The first man was from the earth, a man of dust. The second man is from heaven. As was the man of dust, so are those who are of the dust. And as is the man of heaven, so are those who are of heaven. Just as we have been born the image of the man of dust, we shall also bear the image of the man of heavens. What an amazing passage there in 1 Corinthians 15, verses 42 to 49. That's tremendous there. So he says the physical must come first so it could be spiritualized, as Jesus says, unless the grain of wheat dies, it remains only a grain of wheat. But if it dies, if it is sown in the earth, up comes the stalk, the germination, and the fruit and the seeds. And Jesus says it bears much fruit. But the seed has to die, and what is mortal has to take on immortality by the influx of the Spirit of God we call grace, and specifically the third person of the Trinity, God, the Holy Spirit. So thinking of these things together in this great constellation of meaning about the metaphysics of spirit, that is personal spiritual being, in the case of human beings, the soul in relation to the body. In the case of the angel, a finite personal spiritual being. It is incorporeal, does not have a body, made of atoms. And by way of analogy, the case of the Trinity of persons who together are God, is God. So Edith Stein attributes this creative movement to the necessary origin of all actualized being, pure act or pure spirit, who merits the name God. So before I go into the next quote, I'm just going to wrap up the live stream for here and say this other one for later that gets a bit more theological into understanding spirit by contemplating divinity more directly rather than indirectly. So we began with the movement of the human person in relation to the other who faces me. What we mean by spiritual being and the metaphysical substance of spirit is the formal, actual, substantial core of the person that we call the soul in metaphysics. In Greek, psyche, in Hebrew, nephesh, the living being, that is the human being. In Latin, anima. The body is animated. We say there's death when the body is no longer animated and goes through rigor mortis. There's no heartbeat, there's no respiration. But it is not the heartbeat and respiration that make the person that make the person alive. Those are signs of life biologically. But what makes the one living and the evidence of life is this intentionality of love, of gift, of movement toward the other because of awareness of the other, solicitude for the other, care and concern for the other. And then there's a movement, a welcoming, a hospitality of the proximity of the other to come near me, more near me. Let me share with you my food, my drink, my clothes, my shelter, my money, my goods, my stuff. Let me share with you my very flesh, and how intimate this is in the sacrament of marriage between one man and one woman, how intimate this is in the experience of maternity with the child living in one's womb and nursing the child who has been born. This manifestation of the interiority of spirit through the exteriority of ethical living, of love and responsibility. Here we have the self-revelation of spirit in and through the body, through meaningful, ethical acts that act with a price, that love at a cost. So thank you so much for joining me in this live stream. It's a great gift to me, your interest, your presence. If you have comments, please put them in the comment section after the video. I'd love to interact there. And also, if you're not already a subscriber, I invite you to subscribe and get updates of the latest live streams. I try to live stream Monday through Friday, about an hour a day. And I'll continue with commentary on this 2017 book of mine, Human and Divine Being, a study on the theological anthropology of Edith Stein. Thank you so much for your sincere interest. I look forward to getting to know you more over the days ahead, and continuing to think to the whole, pray from the heart, and to live as a witness. We'll see you in the next one.